Well, welcome, folks. I'm Brian Bates. I was on the board for the Festival of Science for about 11 or 12 years. I even worked with Kathy. And, pardon?
Talk a little louder.
Talk a little louder. Any rate, it's a real honor to be here this evening. I've known the Vasquez family for quite a while, and they're one of the, I think, very unique families of Flagstaff. And I was fortunate to meet Jeronimo. We both have an interest in the Maya astronomy. And I've been on the board for the Society for Cultural Astronomy for several years. And I convinced Jeronimo to do a presentation at our different conferences. I think he did 2 of them. And with that, we became close friends. He became one of my teachers on the Maya astronomy, and I helped him a bit with the Maya mathematics, which is fascinating and which I assume you will be speaking about tonight. So what Jeronimo is going to share with us this evening is research that just came out in the winter. I think it was January or February of this year. April of 23. Excuse me, I got the wrong time. At any rate, it's a fascinating topic, and the 819-day calendar completely changed what some of the Mayan archaeologists were thinking, and it forced them to look at a broader scale in terms of Mayan astronomy. And with that, I present to you Jeronimo Vasquez.
Thank you. Here? Like that?
Yeah, and that's for the Zoom people.
Okay.
So you have to talk loud.
Speak loud like my teacher voice?
Yes, teacher.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We didn't expect as many people, so we didn't have as many chairs, but thank you for your patience and being here. Really excited tonight to talk a little bit about this. I want to say thank you to Brian for introducing me, because he's the one that pushed me to really look into the origins of the calendar. And so several years ago, when I did that first presentation about the formation of 0 and how that led into the Mayan calendars, that was really the first time I got anything published, and was really taking this beyond just drawing hieroglyphs. Because as a kid, I loved drawing hieroglyphs. My dad's an anthropologist, and he had all these Mayan books around. And so I would always be drawing the hieroglyphs. And so tonight, what I want to share with you is about the 819 calendar. In 2023, these two anthropologists from Tulane University made a discovery, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that discovery tonight. So I call this presentation Mayan Planetary Science, Implications of the 819-Day Calendar. And the date today is September 26th. I always share this when any presentation I do, I connect it to the long count. Ishimlu means the land of corn. Ishimlu, 13 Aktun, 0 Katun, 11 Tun, 6 Winales, 17 days, and today is 11 Noch, 0 Yash, and that's the long count of today. This information here below, 0.0.2.3.10, Hunke, 0 Yakshin. This is something new that I've put on for this presentation, because this represents where we're at on the 819 count. And so that's something that I wanted to share tonight. I've been studying the 819 for many, many years, but the information that was out there, because it's been known about since the 1950s, thought that there were only 4 directions, and so they were counting the 819 cycle through 4. And that didn't line up. They weren't sure why it was important. And so tonight I'll talk a little bit about why it's important. Next slide, please. All right. So Mayan planetary science. right? It was based on a framework of the Winal, which is 20, and I'll talk more about that. And they used it for everything, how to organize their political organization, when to do ceremony, when to go to war, when to commemorate events. They aligned it with the stars when they were having these special ceremonies. And this calendar tracked the synodic nodes, which means when you look in the sky, the same spot. So for a planet to repeat in that same spot, that's considered the synodic node. And this cycle actually tracked all 5 visible planets. And that, we didn't understand why until 2023. Next slide, please. So this is a quote that is about the principle of a how, zero, and the universe. And everything started with a beginning. The principle that generated everything gave rise to everything. It started with an initial energy, the stem cell that multiplied it 1 and 400 times. The principle of life, which engineered life in others. The principle of life is energy. The principle of life is the mother and the father. The principle of life is the seed. The principle of life is the flower. The principle of life is a how. A how means Lord, but it also means zero. Okay, and the Museo Bats, 1993. And this symbol here represents zero. And then this, the traje in this picture, significant to me because that's the Sutuil Maya, same with the band up top, who are the people of the many flower house and coming from the house of birds. And so that's special to me because that's the village where my parents met and where I did my research for my master's degree. Next slide, please. So let's talk about Wakashish, which is zero, okay? In Western civilization, we talk about zero as the concept of nothingness. But to the Maya, zero was everything. It was the beginning and the end. It was that 0 point where the past meets the future, which is the present. And so that's why zero became the concept of everything. And it included birth, death, cycles, beginning of cycles, ending of cycles, and it is demonstrated by the flower and also the glyph Ahau, or Lord. And so this allowed the Maya to create this system of 20 days, which this is what I track here. These are one way of demonstrating the 20 days. You have zero, and this glyph here represented 0 and 0, one meaning beginning and one meaning ending, but both meaning 0. Again, like I said, that point where the past meets the future, the present. And so there's another way of writing 0, the bars and lines, you might be familiar with that. And then the words in Cachiquel, and my mom is Cachiquel, so that's our mother language, that also counts the numbers. And so this system, once they were able to develop 20, they were able to create all these really cool calendars through scientific observation. Next slide, please. Okay, the knowledge and exercise of the Cholik orients the physical and spiritual balance of the people and propagates the harmonic balance between human beings, nature, and the cosmos. The Maya developed this information through constant observation. Now, some of these cycles that we're talking about took 44 years, 52 years, 104 years to repeat themselves. Well, no one human being can sit there and build this out and observe it by themselves. It took multiple generations to confirm this star knowledge, which was later created into these calendars and written. So we have written evidence from the classic period, which is about 700 AD, but this knowledge goes back thousands of years. People had to watch the stars. They told stories and tied it all together. This picture right here is an example of how the Maya used their architecture to develop and observe the stars. So they would put the temple in the middle for the sunrise, and it would be at the equinox. So at the equinox twice a year, the sun would rise there. And then they would have their summer solstice and winter solstice also marked by these pyramids. And so it was a way that they could track the sun. There's similar petroglyphs here locally. The Hopi have some, and the ancient Anasazi have some just northeast of here. And so that knowledge, that tracking using the geography to track the stars was used by all indigenous peoples in different ways. The Maya, with their written language, express their information through artistic expression, through the hieroglyphs themselves. Next slide, please. So this is the Cholik. This is produced by Cholsama, by the Cachiquel. And as you can see, there's 20 days to read it. It goes in this order. And this becomes significant with the order, because later on I'm going to talk about how the 819 calendar goes in reverse. And so we'll talk about that. But to describe it, through multiple years of observation, the Maya discovered the biorhythms of the earth and of the universe. They've tracked it over years, and they noticed that different days exhibited different energies. And then with the sacred number of 13, when you multiplied that, you got 13 frequencies of each energy. So like today is Hulahu Noch, which means 11, wisdom. The animal spirit for today is a woodpecker, right? This day is considered a day of knowledge, of sharing knowledge, of learning knowledge. And so it's quite fitting for this presentation today. The Hunwinak, or the 20 energies, correspond to what in Mayan language also means a complete human being who has 10 fingers and 10 toes. So everything in Mayan mathematics, all the calendars that they created, all the different ways that they tracked the stars and tracked the days and eclipses and some of these other natural phenomena, were all based on 20, which was all based on considered a complete human being. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the calendars that is very famous, the Cholik, was the one we just talked about. That's 260 days. That is 20 energies multiplied by 13. The solar calendar, the Menhab, that's a 365-day calendar. That tracks one full year. And the Maya did it through 18 months of 20 days each, or 18 winales, and 5 extra days, which were considered the Weeb, or the resting days, to transfer to one of 4 days to start the new year calendar. This tracked 52 years before it repeated itself. And so the 4 new year bearers, every year it would rotate by 5 to create those year bearers. These are the months. I like this because it's in Spanish. A lot of these pictures are screenshots that I got from Mayan Facebook pages where they're presenting this information, and so I left it on there so you can see, how the Maya are using their own cultural knowledge. Next slide, please. So when you combined the Cholik, the 260-day calendar, and the Menhab, the 365-day calendar, it came together with what's known as the calendar round, and that piece was attached to the Choltun. The Choltun is what you know as the long count calendar. So if you remember December 21st, 2022, it was supposed to be the end of the world because the calendar was ending. Well, that was because we were using Western lens to look at that calendar. What we were saying to our people was it was the end of a cycle, a great cycle of almost 5,200 years, but it was just the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. So currently, we're 12 going on 13 years into the new Baktun cycle. Now, this long count calendar has been keeping time since August 11th, 3114 BC. It's a linear calendar. So if you think about it, 3114 BC, that's over 5,000 years ago. This knowledge was already there. Archaeologists say, well, the earliest known glyphs that we have about the calendar round were 600 BC. But think about that. How much time did it take to get to 600 BC, where the calendar was already complete and was able to be written out. And so I don't believe, as has been stated, that the long count calendar was created in the classic period of the Maya in like 500, 600 AD, and then counted backwards to the origin date. I don't agree with that, because if you look at this big cycle, and we're right here, and this is 5,200 years, how is it that they created it here and counted all the way back to the first day? That doesn't make sense. It was ancestral knowledge. It might not have been as sophisticated. It might not have started as written language or carved in stone, but it was knowledge that was passed on through stories, through oral traditions, generation upon generation upon generation, first creating it, establishing it. And what I believe is that this date was when it was completed and demonstrated for a full cycle to work. So next cycle, please. So predictive astronomy. Once the Maya understood these biorhythms, understood these cycles, told them in their stories and tracked them and demonstrated over hundreds of years that these cycles worked, they could now predict. So the astronomy that we talk about in the classic period, which is around 700 to 800 AD, and then the post-classic period, the 1200 AD, that was predictive astronomy. They knew the calendar well enough and the biorhythms well enough that they could predict when there would be eclipses. They could predict when Jupiter and Saturn would be in conjunction together in the sky. They could predict when Venus would show up as a morning star and later as an evening star. They could predict when these happened. And they knew how to walk the right places on the right days, and how to do the right work on the right days, how to speak the right words on the right days. From among all the days with 13 numbers and 20 days, or 20 names, 260 in all, the days it took from the time a vestigial being, a human being, makes its first presence known in the womb till the time it sees light. So what this quote is saying is that as they knew the calendar and the 260 days, what else lasts 260 days that's important to human beings? Pregnancy, exactly. Human gestation is roughly about 260 days. And because they knew this, they could consult with their books and consult with their knowledge people and make decisions on when to get married, when to have a child, what kind of, knowing what day you were born on would tell what kind of traits you have and what kind of jobs you would have great skill at. And so people could orient and use the calendar to orient their lives and decide how they were going to contribute to society. Next slide, please. So traditional planetary knowledge, the Popol Vuh, which is considered like the Mayan Bible, it has the Mayan creation story, tells stories of the underworld reflected in the night sky. So for the Maya, at night, what happened was the underworld, which is beneath us, right, at night would come and be reflected above. And so the stories that they told through the Popol Vuh told the stories of different stars and different planets moving through the sky. And that's how that knowledge was passed on. Now, the Popol Vuh was discovered in the 1600s, written by conquered Quiche Maya at the 15, 1600s. And so they always thought that that was a post-classic interpretation of Maya using information that was influenced by Catholicism and the Spaniards. But through archaeology in the last 20 years, they've found cities like El Mirador, which had the Popol Vuh carved on buildings before the time of Christ. And so it confirmed that this knowledge has been there throughout the different Mayan peoples for over 2,000 years. And so the 18-day count was a night calendar. And I almost changed to talk about it as 819 night calendar, because you don't track the stars in the daytime except at moments when you get the morning star. So it tracked all 5 synodic cycles for the visible planets with the naked eye. And it was, like I said earlier, it tracked when a star rose in that exact same spot, how many days it took. And so this calendar was perfected and first seen in the hieroglyphs in the city of Palenque in around 600 AD. And so this knowledge was worked on and developed and perfected by 600 AD. Next slide, please. So the calendar was formed by 13 cycles of 63 days. Now, the key numbers for the 819 cycle are 7, 9, and 13. If you multiply 6 times 7, that's 63, and then multiply that by 13, that becomes 819. Well, there are patterns that emerge from the glyphs that show that every 63 days, there were rituals that they would perform known as fire rituals. Okay, 63 days is also important because it has big ties to the planet Saturn. And so you can see some of the cycles that emerge from that. 260 cycles of 63 days is the equivalent of 20 cycles of 819 days. And that's where it gets really cool, some of this math and how some of these factors tie in together. And the calendar starts on Hun Noch and goes backwards compared to the Cholik. So if you remember, I was showing you the calendar and I was saying it goes this way. Well, this, instead of getting larger, instead of going from Noch to Tihash to Kawak to Ahau, it goes backwards. It goes Noch to Amach to Skin to Ish to Ah to Eh to Bats. And so that's part of how this calendar is like a mirror image of the solar calendar. Next slide, please. And so this is some of what I put this together to visually show some of what I was talking about. So this is the traditional glyph of what the Maya universe looks like. And you have the 4 directions, east, north, west, south. You have the terrestrial world where we live now. You have the underworld, and then you have heavens up above. And then this is the Seba tree, the tree of life that connects all 3. Okay? So when you look at the calendar round or the Menhab calendar, it goes the year bearers. And when I'm talking about the directional, I'm talking about year bearers. The calendar starts on 1 Noch. It won't return to 1 Noch for 52 years, but each year that it transfers, it goes counterclockwise from west to north to east to south. So it does this on a horizontal plane, right? So the first year you're celebrating, you're looking at the east, the north, the south, or the west, excuse me, the south, right? Now, that's a horizontal orientation. The 819 count also starts on 1 Noch, but it is going in the opposite direction in clockwise. Oh, I didn't fix that. Sorry about that. So it goes clockwise. So it goes from the east to the south to the west to the north. And so, as I said, it's like a mirror image of the solar calendar, but going in the opposite direction. Next slide, please. And it has the other thing I need to point out. This is different as well because it has a vertical orientation. So instead of being the horizontal, it's looking at zenith, nadir. So it starts in the sunrise, and then nadir is when the sun is in the underworld down below us. So it's during nighttime where the sun is at that moment. Then it goes to sunset. Then it goes to the zenith, to when the sun is directly above, and then back to sunrise. And so it's kind of counterintuitive. It took me a lot of different drawing of the glyphs to understand it, and it didn't all click until 2023. So please, next slide. So these are some of the ratios that they discovered, right? Mercury has a synodic cycle of 117 days. So you have 7 synodic cycles that make up one 819 calendar. So the ratio is 7 to 1. and it has a total days of 819 to create that. Venus has a synodic cycle of 585 days. And remember, these numbers are according to how the Maya understood it. We know it's a little bit off, but super close enough that it fits. So 585 days, which became 7 cycles of the 819 cycle. So the ratio is 7 to 5 819 cycles. That's how it tracks Venus. Mars has a synodic cycle of 780 days, and so there were 21 Mars cycles for every 20 819 cycles. And then you have Jupiter, which has 399 days as a synodic cycle, and it was 39 Jupiter cycles to 19 819 cycles. And then Saturn has a synodic cycle of 378 days, and so 13 Saturn cycles were the equivalent of 6 819 cycles. And so, as you can see, it's all tied in the ratios and the mathematics. Next slide, please. So this is, I put these up as examples of glyphs that show the 819 calendar. Where this is in Yaxchixtlan, one of the lintels or one of the carvings, and it says, let's see, 3. So down here, this is where it describes where on the 819 calendar it is. On this one, it's these 4 here that describe the 819 calendar. So we know that this calendar existed, but again, they've known since the 1950s, but they didn't understand the full significance of this calendar until 2023. Next slide, please. And then there's this article, The Maya 819 Count and Planetary Astronomy by John H. Linden and Victoria R. Bricker. And they were the ones in 2023 that made the discovery that just blew open the 819 calendar for me. And what they did was they realized, okay, there's 4 colors, there's 4 directions, but maybe it's more than that. And so they extrapolated out to 20. Okay, you have 5 glyphs of each color, right? And go through a full 20 cycles. So once they did that, that's when the ratios fit. Once they looked at it, and it makes sense, 20, the winal, right? The complete human being. So once they tied 819 to 20, all of a sudden, all 5 cycles fit into that calendar. And that was like the crucial point. And so these are some tables from their article that I put on here to demonstrate. They started on 1 Imish and did 819 through. So these are the number of days. And as you can see, it goes east, zenith, west, nadir. And it goes backwards. And then here are the different multiple periods that show which planets show up in which cycles. And so again, that was revolutionary for Mayan planetary science. When they implemented that, they solved a problem that had been vexing anthropologists for over 50 years. You know, really 70 years if you think back to the 50s. Next slide, please. And so the beginnings of the 819 calendar, this is where it gets kind of interesting. So this is a drawing of the 7 deities from a vase that they found in Guatemala. And it's in black with white because this is right before creation. Creation, according to Maya, was the August 11th, 3114 BC. That was the day of Forahau, right? The first day of the long count calendar. Well, the 819 count calendar started on 1 Noh, right before creation. So 3 days before the first creation date was the first date of the 819 calendar. And they had to go through and demonstrate 3 times that it was actually accurate. So it went through 3 cycles before Hun Noh, which was August 8th, 3014 BC. And again, that's why I have a hard time saying that, oh yeah, these Mayan priests, these scientists in 700 AD came up with this calendar and counted all the way back and aligned it, and then aligned the 819 calendar as well to the long count calendar. For me, I have a hard time with that. I believe that that knowledge has been there, and it was told verbally. We just haven't found the definitive evidence yet. But like I said, the first calendar round glyphs that we have evidence of are 600 AD or BC, excuse me. So we know by 600 BC that knowledge was already being recorded and written, going from the traditional oral tradition to actually writing and expressing those glyphs. Next slide, please. So let's start with the 5 planets. We have Mercury, also could be known as thunderstorm, has also been identified as Chak, the Mayan deity of Chak, of rain. And when you look in the Dresden Codex, which is from the post-classic time period, about 1200 AD, Chak's movement through the sky is described in 117-day cycles. In the Popol Vuh, Mercury is represented as 4 different versions of an owl. There's 2 morning aspects of the owl and 2 evening. And when I say that, that means the hieroglyphs that they use to represent Mercury were owls, but some had day features and some had night features. And then again, 117 days is one synodic cycle. The 9 cycles of 13 days times 7 cycles equals 819 days. So that Mercury, they kind of figured how it fit into the 819 count because of the fact that it fit so nicely. So that when we still didn't understand completely the 819 count, that was the easy one. Next slide, please. Next, the great star, Venus, Chakek, or the red star. Venus is really cool because it has a complete grand cycle of 104 years. Okay, that's 2 calendar rounds of 52 years each before the morning star will raise in the exact same spot as it did in the sky. It takes 140 years to get to that point. And when I say raise in the sky, it's not just geographically on the earth, it's with the stars behind in relation. And so it's pretty amazing that they were able to discover the cycles of Venus. And think about that. So we talked about it earlier. It takes 3 times to prove something actually happens as a cycle, right? So 104 years. So there were very few people that actually lived through 104 years to see Venus in that spot and go through 1 calendar round and go through a 2nd calendar round to be visible and be alive to track where it was, to confirm it. That means this information was confirmed multi-generational. It took multiple cycles of people to track its spot in the sky, to understand it. And by the 830 AD, it was completely understood, where now they could predict where Venus would be in the morning star, as a morning star, when they could predict evening star. And it all had to do with the 20-day signs. And so they had the glyphs where they could show what day would be arising. There were 5 different Venus cycles, and when they were drawn in the codices, they used different versions of the same deity with different colors. And it really wasn't so much a deity, it was artistic expression of these natural phenomena. Western thought came in and said, oh, these must be gods. These must be deities. Now, there were special natural phenomena, but it wasn't like gods like we think of in the Western philosophy. It's more of these are natural phenomena that are tracked and can be shown, and so they drew it as their artistic expression of those natural phenomena. And of the 584 days and nights of the Venus star, 236 are as a morning star. It disappears for 90 days and then reappears as an evening star for 250 days and then disappears for 8 days again. And so the cool part about this is that 65 Venus cycles is the same as 146 Cholik or 260-day cycles, which is the same as 104 Hab solar cycles. And so you see how all these glyphs meshed together. Next slide, please. Okay, next planet we're going to talk about is Mars. Mars is, so now we've gone from the planets that are closer to the sun, right? Now we're going to the planets that are further from the sun. And so Mars was known as the guardian of the corn silk at the tip of a single ear. And that glyph, which you can't quite see in the corner, that represents that guardian. And it's part of what's known as the celestial triad, which are those three planets, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter, or Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and is known as the deer monster. And of the 18 months, the month Zip was associated with deer hunting, and it started on the day 3 Canil. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the Mars cycle is that it's a 780-day cycle. That's the same as 3 Cholik cycles, or 3 260-day cycles. And so again, it ties into the cycles that they had already counted and developed. And then for the 819 calendar, 21 synodic cycles of 780 days was the same as 20 cycles of 819 days, which is a total of 1,380 days or nights. I prefer nights, but and so when you look at some of these different cycles, you see that 6 synodic cycles of Mars was the same as 13 thuns. Each thun is 360 days, which is the equivalent of 4,680 nights. And for Mars, they had different glyphs to represent as well. So if they represented by monkeys, the howler monkey represented the morning star, and the spider monkey represented the evening star. And so they were able to demonstrate and record that knowledge through this artistic expression. Next slide, please. So this is Jupiter. Jupiter is the guardian of the sun-eyed lord of the shield. Okay, and is part of the celestial triad. 39 synodic nodes of 399 days or nights was the same as 19 cycles of 819, and it has 15,561 nights. Now, Jupiter often showed in retrograde motion, which means it appeared to stop in the sky as the sky was moving behind it. And it had different nodes when that would happen. And they were able to track and predict that. And often the conjunction, meaning both Saturn and Jupiter were shown together, that was very close to the end of a Katun cycle. And so when there was a Katun cycle, which was roughly about 19 and a half years, they would mark it. So it didn't happen every time, but it happened within every 3 times. And so those were special times when they would raise monuments and carve it in. And sometimes it would be like if it was the birth of a king or the death of a lord, but they would wait and adjust it so that they would actually dedicate that on the day that that planet appeared in the sky. And so this picture that I chose to include here is an example of the connection between Jupiter, Saturn, and the eclipses. So that is from the Dresden Codex, and that basically tells you on which days those conjunctions and those will happen together. Well, you'll see an eclipse with Saturn and Jupiter. And this again is a picture that I took from a Mayan site that was created by there's several of them, and this knowledge is being shared more and used as our peoples have relearned some of the language, relearned how to utilize the knowledge and connect it with stories that were told through time and memorial from generation to generation. They're starting to utilize this and creating digital expressions so that this knowledge isn't just theoretical knowledge from the past, but is actually working knowledge that people can use now. Next slide, please. So Saturn, the guardian of the young mirror scepter. And again, the glyph up there represents Saturn, and as part of the celestial triad. It had a synodic node of 378 nights, with 63 nights times 6. So again, remember we talked earlier about 63. 63 is really important. That's when they do the fire drill ceremonies or fire ceremonies. And the 6 cycles of those fire ceremonies was Saturn. When you get 13 cycles of Saturn, you get 6 cycles of the 819 calendar. And again, I go back and forth between nights and days. In my mind, it's really we're counting nights because you don't really track the planets during the day. And eventually I'll talk about, not in this presentation, but there are actually 2 different versions of the calendar that tracks the energies of the day from sunrise and watch it from the east, and all their orientations are that way. But there's another orientation of the Choli calendar, the 260-day calendar, that tracks it from sunset. So for like my people, the Cachiquel, we are considered people of the bat, and that's our symbol. Well, we track the energy of the day signs, not at sunrise, meaning that today is 11 Noch on sunrise. 11 Noch for us started last night at sunset and ended right now as the sun sets again to start the new energy, which will be 12 Tihash. And so that's where, for my mind, I think about nights, and that's to be my next presentation. Now, Saturn was important because it could be substituted for other celestial bodies. And when I'm talking about celestial bodies, I'm talking about Jupiter or Mars, because for them it was for ancient Maya, it was very important when 2 or more of these stars showed up in the sky at the same time. And so that's where they would be having monuments, or they would track special events and tag it, because that's a very special moment. And when they could predict it, they knew when that was happening, and they would align their architecture, they would align their ceremonies and their big events around those celestial bodies appearing in the sky. Next slide, please. So in my conclusions, the ancient people observed the natural world and discovered universal biorhythms and patterns, right? Through oral tradition, through sharing, through stories, through then documenting it and writing it out over hundreds of years. This knowledge was shared, was observed, and confirmed through multiple generations, where by the post-classic period, and we see the codices that have survived that tell us these cycles of these different planets, that knowledge was thousands of years old, that had been developed and repeated over and over again through stories, then written. And unfortunately, the majority of the books were burned when the Spanish came of our ancestral knowledge. That's why it was lost. For 500 years, Mayan knowledge was persecuted. The civil war in Guatemala was a Mayan genocide. It ended in 1996. And so it tells you that was in my lifetime, right? And this knowledge has only reemerged since it's become safe for our elders to share this knowledge. Because during that genocide, if you were a traditional person and you spoke about traditional knowledge, you were targeted as a subversive and killed. And so many of our ancient seers and folks that knew this knowledge were killed during the Civil War. And so those that maintained this knowledge kept it in and did not share it. And so it's just now in these last 20, 25 years that this knowledge is starting to emerge again. This represents an expression of scientific information through artistic expression. And this includes stories, the hieroglyphs, but also their architecture. There's a building in Syros, Belize, that was built around the turn 400 BC is when they started it, that tracked Venus. that it was built with the orientation so that when Venus was in the morning star, it rose on one side, and when Venus rose on the evening star, it rose on the other, and the glyphs on the building itself had the glyphs of Venus for the morning star and the evening star on the building. They oriented their buildings to watch the different alignments of different stars. And so that going back to that original slide that I showed of the 3 pyramids and how the solstice and sun, well, that was the same. They oriented their buildings also for different planets as well. And then the 819 calendar was connected to the long count calendar, and in many different ways, it's its mirror opposite, right? And I showed that earlier through the directions, how for the long count calendar, you go one direction, the 819 in the other, in terms of every 4 years changing the colors and directions. And then this knowledge, as I've mentioned many times before, is reemerging as the Mayan people are, 1, relearning the language, 2, going back to their stories and sharing that knowledge with their young people, and it's reemerging as that energy and that essence, as was predicted with the end of the previous cycle, the 13 Baktun cycle, and the beginning of the new one that we're in now. So this knowledge is reemerging. It's very special knowledge, and it will continue to grow, and it's really neat to watch. I mean, when I was young, they were just, you could only find information from books. And then in the 2000s, I hooked up with Cholsama, which is a publishing company from Guatemala, and you could get some of this knowledge. It was there. But now with the explosion of social media, there are these Facebook groups and Instagram groups that post the calendar every single day with knowledge about it. That was never there when I started learning about the calendar. But it's pretty cool when you find this knowledge and you compare it to knowledge you already had, and it confirms itself, right? Like, for example, the pattern of the 20 days that start the 819 count. When I figured out what they said about the 20 count, I started drawing out the calendar, and I found a pattern that it was going backwards, right? Well, I learned that pattern through drawing the calendar. I barely read that article we talked about. That was a break article for the very first time this week. And it confirmed everything I had already been saying, but I figured, oh, I'm getting ready for this presentation. I probably should read what they're saying so I can make sure that I'm in alignment with it. And that was what was gratifying, having used knowledge and experience that I had learned over the years of the calendar, studying with my elders, meeting with astronomers like Brian, and asking those questions. Because when I started this process, I was all excited, telling Brian, yeah, they could do this, and they could figure out when an eclipse was going to happen, or when the sun was going to rise here. And he's like, yeah, we know all that. How did it start? Go back to the beginning. And so that was my very first, really research into the origins, and that's where I came up with talking about 0. The glyph, remember, I was talking about this. This is super important, because if you think about in ancient times, where you had peoples that maybe spoke a Paleolithic language version, Proto-Maya, or maybe couldn't really communicate. But if I come up to you and I'm like this and this, which means beginning of 0 and ending with 0, and you understand that, I know you know the concept of 0. It's a way of using hand signs to demonstrate that knowledge. But it took me years of looking at the calendar to figure that out. Like I had when we first started the day signs that had the 20 numbers, and I looked at that, and then one day it just dawned on me, it's like, wow, that's what he's doing. It's just a face with the hand right here. It's like, wow, beginning, completion, right? And so once they understood that and had their 20 down, everything else is built on that. All the other calendars, all the other cycles were built on that basic concept of the Winal, or Hun Winak, which is a complete human being. And so with that, next slide, please. Thank you. Gracias, Matias. Thank you. Are there any questions? This is the first time that I'm presenting this information, so it was a little rough. No, I think we're good for right now. Okay, I guess we will have lights. Whew. All right. So are there any questions? Yes.
Two questions. Is the Mayan, like, their homes, you know if those were made at, like, what material?
So are you talking about their homes or the pyramids that they used to observe the stars?
Their home.
Their homes were usually thatch huts, but then if they were priests or lords or merchants that had money, not money, but wealth, then they could build stone buildings. And so a lot of times when you see the pyramids, on top they have a little stone like hut. It's built like a thatch hut, like what was traditionally built, but up on top of a pyramid, which is what their recreation of mountains. So what they did was they saw, like, you go through the lowlands of Guatemala and, you know, in Mexico, and you look out and you see some hills that you think are hills. Well, now that we have LiDAR, we're discovering that those aren't hills. Those are pyramids that people built, man-made structures. And so what LiDAR, which is a technique that was developed in 2016 or 17, that was used to shoot lasers into the ground and it reflect back and record that knowledge. They've learned that the Maya world, the Maya area, was actually 10 times more dense than we believed. And so Mayan archaeology is basically pre-LiDAR, post-LiDAR. And we're barely 8 years in, you know, we're barely starting to realize that and understand that. And so a lot of this star knowledge will be coming out more as we make those connections. But the key point was that work that was done in 2023 that expanded out the 819 cycle to 20, because once they did that, all the planets fit in there. Any other questions? Yes.
Why did the Mayans tie their lives so closely to yours?
Well, you think about it, it's part of it's for their agricultural cycle, right? So you have to, I believe that first was tracking the sun, because you're farmers and you need to make sure you got your crops. And so they were tracking it and creating it that way. But then you also look at human gestation, 260, that was their sacred calendar. And so they used that to orient everything. And it was like that. I have a book that I like to read. I definitely recommend it, by Susan Rice, that's called Mayan Political Science. And they went so far in, like, this is later on. In the beginning, it was, you know, Paleo Indians, and it wasn't just Maya, it was more, because this knowledge was throughout Mesoamerica, in Oaxaca, all the way. And so the orientation became their way of organizing their lives. And to the point where there's one cycle, the short count Katun cycle, or the May cycle, that's 256 years. And it was a Katun cycle of 720 days times 13. And every 13 cycle, they would rotate which city was the lead city. So like they were organized to that point where they would share leadership of which were the cities that were most in charge. And so it was a way of connecting in to the natural rhythms. And I kind of equate it like this. If you understand the natural rhythms of the universe and you're in tune to the point where you know when there's going to be an eclipse, or you know when the rains are coming or when they're not, and you can tie yourself and plug into that, that's what the quote was saying about they know which days to do which ceremonies, because it was like plugging into the internet and having full power, right? Like total understanding of what the cosmos was doing. And so, you know, this wasn't knowledge that just developed over a couple years. It took thousands of years to get there. And as they understood it more, they oriented themselves around it. Because if you think about it, a lord or a king that was able to build some of these huge pyramids that took thousands and thousands of hours of man hour. I mean, they're talking some of these pyramids that took like 15 years to build. You know, it took thousands of people to build it. You know, if you have the ability to say, on this day, get ready, tomorrow there's going to be an eclipse and we're going to do a ceremony, and you have farmers who don't understand the full cycles but understand the basics, and it happens, that's showing that you're a divine king. You know the patterns of the universe, right? And that was pretty powerful. And so as the society got more complex, they oriented it around the calendars. And something that can be said too is that, we talk about the collapse of the Maya. It wasn't that the Maya, per se, collapsed, which the big cities did and the big city-states did. But what happened was they had used up their resources. Sound familiar? We're kind of at that point now, right? But they learned that the system of kings that they were using then didn't work for them anymore. And so they left and migrated to other areas where either the system wasn't as complex or the system was able to absorb them, or where they could go start their own system, right? You talk about, like, for example, Teotihuacan is in central Mexico, right? Now, Teotihuacan actually conquered Tikal in about 375 AD and became the new rulers and introduced the kind of Mexicanized version of the Maya, which helped propel like Tikal and some of these other great city-states because of the trade all the way to central Mexico. Well, when Teotihuacan fell in about 650 AD, they talk about different tribes leaving, right? And there's some peoples that came and went south and merged with the Maya who are there now. That includes the Quiche, and later the Cachiquel, my people, and later the Sutuil, who were originally Quichean and then branched off. And they merged with those people that were there, the old Maya. So it was kind of like, they call it Nahuatized Maya because it was Mexican influence, right? Now, there's some other peoples that went north, and some of those people settled with the people in this area, and those became the Pueblo people, like the Hopi. Some of their clans that come from the south came from that migration, right? And what's really cool is that, so one of the cities that was really important for astronomy during the classic period was Copan. Well, Copan is in Honduras, and it has a bat as its symbol. Well, my people, the Cachiquel, and several others did a migration there, got their vara or their bundle, sacred bundle of lordship to say that you are recognized as your own kingdom. And then they went back to Guatemala and formed the Cachiquel nation. Now, it's really cool, and this is another piece of research that I'm looking into, is, remember earlier I was talking about the two different versions of the calendar, right? The day calendar and the night calendar. Well, the Quiche, which is the main language family group from that area, their name means the many tree people. So that's who they are. Well, the Cachiquel broke off and became their own kingdom. Their name means the fire tree people. When do you use fire trees? Those are torches at night. All right? And so I'm working to do some more research to identify those connections. But what I found really cool is that you got Copan in Honduras, you got the Cachiquel in Guatemala, and you have the Tzotzil in Chiapas, Mexico, that are all bat people and use bat symbolism and consider themselves people of the night. And so that's why I go back to the 819 calendar being a nocturnal calendar rather than a solar-based calendar. And that's why I like calling it 819 night calendar over day calendar, because it's pretty hard to track the stars in the daytime unless you get that morning star every once in a while. Any other questions? Yes.
Indication that things like a comet may have been a bad omen or some fear of an eclipse, especially a lunar eclipse, or anything like that.
I think maybe for people that weren't educated and didn't know, and maybe there was an element of those folks that were trying to portray themselves as dynastic kings and divine kings, they utilized it to their advantage. So those that didn't know that knowledge then yes, there was probably some of those fears. But that knowledge that was there among those people that were timekeepers and understood that knowledge, I don't think it was much fear. It was more of just understanding those biorhythms. And then that's the human element of using that for your advantage, right? And again, I go back to, you know, in the classic, pre-classic to the classic period, that you had these kingdoms in this way. And then as it fell, people just moved and went to other areas and either established post-classic kingdoms or were absorbed. So like you think about the Yucatan, you have the lowlands, and that's where Tikal and Calakmul and some of these places that fell in the classic period, they just moved to the highlands. And that's the Cachiquel, the Quiché, or they moved up north to Chichen Itza and Mayapan and some of those communities that never collapsed, that were built in like the 700s and went all the way till Spanish contact. So it wasn't so much of a collapse of like the Maya disappeared. No, they just realized that the system of organization, the political system that they're living under wasn't working. They used up all their resources around them and they started to collapse. And so now these divine kings would promise rains, and guess what? No rains came, right? And there was extended droughts. And so now their claim to be connected with, you know, God or the universe was disconnected. And so people lost faith in that. And so then that's where they migrated out. Yes?
Is the Mayan discovery of zero, does that predate the Arabic, the development of the Arabic numeric system that we use today?
Yes, it does. And it was developed independently, right? And that's where I go back to. The Arabic version of zero really talks about how to calculate the value of nothingness. But for the Maya, when they were looking at zero, they were looking at the beginning of everything and the completion of something to begin a new cycle. Yes? Okay, cool. Last question. Yes?
It's really a comment and a question. I appreciate what you're doing. You helped me a little bit my history. I lived in a small Mayan Indian village in 1983 near Chichen Itza.
Oh, nice.
And now I'm working with the Hopis, and you kind of made a connection for me there. So thank you. I missed the very first minutes of the presentation. Are you some type of anthropologist?
I do have a master's degree in anthropology, and my dad is also an anthropologist. So he had, even though he didn't study the hieroglyphs to that degree like I did, he had the books laying around. So when I was like 10, 12 years old, I was constantly reading them. And then in my 20s, I started drawing the hieroglyphs to understand them. And then I did my master's degree in 2004 in Santiago Atitlan in Guatemala, working on cultural preservation in that community, helped build a cultural center. And it was during that time that I got stories and worked with my elders there to understand some of the calendar. And then I just went with it over the years of just drawing it over and over again. Because that's the thing with the Mayan calendar. There are patterns that emerge when you draw it over and over again. But you never see that because those books were burned, right? All you see, like in the Dresden Codex, they don't draw out all the days that you need for the calendar. They just draw out the first day. And you're supposed to know what goes in there till the next time the glyph comes, and then the next time. And so that is different than, oh, I'm going to draw out all 260 days of the calendar to understand the pattern. Or I'm going to draw out all 360 days of a tun. Like that's another thing that's kind of cool. Like the tun is the base of the long count calendar. It starts at 0, which is, or ends at 0 and starts at 1 Imosh. It's 360 days. In the solar version on the Menhab calendar is 18 months of 20 days. But there's another way to get the tun. 9 cycles of 40 days also creates the tun. So that's the nocturnal version of the tun. And so that's what I'm currently researching and exploring is that duality. Because in Western society, it's all or nothing. It's either black or white, you know? And with the Maya and with the indigenous people, there's always been that duality, that there's both. And we have what's known as a quadrifoil orientation. That's the 4 directions, right? Well, if you think about it and you create that quadrant, you have plus, 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 minus, plus, minus, 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 plus, right, in your graphs. Well, that's what the Maya believe as well, that it's not left-handed people are good or bad and right-handed people are good. It's there's good left-handed people and there's bad left-handed people. There's good right-handed people and there's bad right-handed people. And so it's a different way of looking and thinking of the world and understanding other folks and understanding other traditions. And you get away from that idea of it's all or nothing. It's my way or the highway. You're either in the light or you're in the dark. Well, there's people that are in the dark that are good, right? My people, Cachiquel, you can't say they're all evil because they're night people, right? There's good night people and there's bad night people, just like there's good solar people and there's bad solar people. And so it's just that different way of philosophy. Thank you. All right, well, I think we're good. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you.
If you have children, you will know. I knew he used to sit and spaced out. We went to the pyramids and he was reading the hieroglyphs and their drawing. He was 5 years old, and we left him in Santiago Chiclan with his elder, and he came back with all of this knowledge. I don't know what happened. But he always surprised me. Today I am very surprised for all of this knowledge that he gathered in a couple of weeks, right?
And this is my mom, if you didn't figure that part out.